Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Bell That Rang for No One, a Miss Marple mystery narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome to Velvet Clues, where mysteries unfold like silk in candlelight. I'm Connor, your guide through shadows and secrets, and tonight we journey with the incomparable Miss Jane Marple to the village of St. Bartholomew's Hollow, where bells toll for the dead and sometimes for the guilty. Pour yourself something warm, settle into your favourite chair, and let us begin this tale of hidden sins and deadly silence. Chapter 1. When Dawn Brings Death Instead of Prayer. The morning mist clung to St. Bartholomew's Hollow like a guilty conscience refusing to lift, even as the sun painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Miss Jane Marple had risen early, as was her custom, to tend to her small garden behind Rose Cottage, which she had rented for a peaceful fortnight in this charming Cotswold village. The previous evening's rain had left the air fresh and clean, perfect for an early morning among her borrowed roses. She was dead-heading a particularly stubborn bloom when the church bell began to toll. The deep, resonant notes echoed across the village with their familiar call to morning prayer, each chime marking the steady rhythm of rural life that had remained unchanged for centuries. But something about the tolling struck Miss Marple as odd. The timing was wrong. Morning service wasn't for another 2 hours, and there was something irregular about the rhythm, as if the ringer was uncertain or distressed. Miss Marple straightened, her keen blue eyes turning toward the ancient stone church that dominated the village square. Bartholomew's had stood sentinel over the community since the 13th century, its Norman tower rising like a prayer made manifest above the huddle of thatched cottages and modern conveniences that comprised the village proper. The bell continued its irregular tolling for perhaps 3 minutes before falling silent, with an abruptness that seemed almost violent in the morning stillness. Setting down her gardening shears, Miss Marple made her way to the low stone wall that bordered her temporary garden. From this vantage point she could see the entire village spread before her like a picture postcard, honey-coloured stone and climbing roses. Yet something felt wrong in this peaceful tableau, though she couldn't quite identify what had caught her attention. It was then that she saw Mrs. Weatherby, the vicar's wife, emerge from the church at an unseemly pace, her usually composed demeanour replaced by obvious distress. The woman's grey hair had escaped its customary neat arrangement, and she clutched her shawl about her shoulders as if seeking protection from more than the morning chill. Mrs. Weatherby's face was pale as parchment, and even from a distance Miss Marple could see that the woman was deeply shaken. Behind Mrs. Weatherby came Dr. Morrison, the village physician, moving with the purposeful stride of a man summoned to an emergency. His medical bag swung at his side, catching the early sunlight, and his expression was grim. The sight of the doctor entering the church at such an unusual hour, combined with Mrs. Weatherby's obvious distress, confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicion that something was seriously amiss. Within minutes, other figures began to appear. Constable Henley arrived on his bicycle, the machine's bell chiming incongruously cheerful notes as he dismounted and leaned it against the church gate. Inspector Craddock's motor car appeared shortly thereafter, its polished black surface reflecting the morning sky as it drew to a halt beside the lych gate. Miss Marple recognised the inspector from her previous encounters with such unfortunate circumstances, and his presence confirmed her worst fears. Unable to resist the pull of curiosity, and perhaps feeling a certain responsibility to the community that had welcomed her so warmly, Miss Marple made her way toward the church. The village square was beginning to stir with early risers drawn by the unusual activity. Mrs. Pemberton from the post office stood in her doorway, her arms crossed and her expression watchful. Mr. Hartwell, the church warden, hurried across the square with his jacket only half buttoned, clearly having dressed in haste. As Miss Marple approached the church she could hear voices from within, though the ancient stone walls muffled the words. The great oak doors stood open, unusual for this early hour, and she could see figures moving in the shadows of the nave. Inspector Craddock emerged just as she reached the gate, his face wearing the carefully neutral expression that policemen adopted when dealing with serious matters. "Miss Marple," he said, touching his hat in greeting. His voice carried a note of weary recognition as if her appearance at the scene of mysterious circumstances was as inevitable as the sunrise. "I should have expected to find you here." "Inspector Craddock," she replied pleasantly, though her sharp eyes were already taking in every detail of the scene before her. "I do hope nothing too dreadful has occurred. The bell was tolling so strangely this morning, and poor Mrs. Weatherby seemed quite overcome." The inspector's expression grew more serious. "I'm afraid we have a rather grave situation. Mr. Aldrich, the church organist, has been found dead in the bell tower. Mrs. Weatherby discovered the body when she came early to arrange the flowers for today's service." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the calm attention she brought to all human tragedies. Theodore Aldrich had been the church organist for nearly 30 years, a quiet man in his 60s who lived alone in a cottage near the church. She had met him briefly at the village tea shop, where his reserved manner and careful attention to detail had struck her as typical of his musical profession. "How very sad," she murmured, her gaze moving to the bell tower that rose above them. "And you say he was found in the belfry itself? How unusual. Was Mr. Aldrich in the habit of going up there?" Inspector Craddock followed her gaze upward. "That's one of the puzzling aspects, Miss Marple. According to Mr. Hartwell, the church warden, Aldrich never went near the bell tower. He was apparently quite afraid of heights. Yet there he was, lying beneath the great bell as if he had fallen from the platform above." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A man afraid of heights, found dead in the very place he would naturally avoid, suggested circumstances far more complex than a simple accident. "And the bell tolling this morning, was that connected to his presence there?" "Another mystery," the inspector admitted. "The bell rope hangs down into the nave, but it shows no signs of recent use. Yet Mrs. Weatherby swears the bell was tolling when she arrived. She thought perhaps Aldrich was practicing some special peal for the harvest festival next week." As they spoke, Dr. Morrison emerged from the church, his medical bag now carried with the careful deliberation of a man who had completed an unpleasant duty. His face was grave as he approached them, and Miss Marple noted the slight tremor in his hands that suggested the examination had been particularly disturbing. "Inspector," Dr. Morrison said quietly, "I've completed my preliminary examination. Mr. Aldrich has been dead for several hours, probably since some time after midnight. The cause appears to be a broken neck, consistent with a fall from some height." Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught something in the doctor's tone, a hesitation that suggested there were details he found troubling. "You sound uncertain, Doctor. Was there something unusual about Mr. Aldrich's injuries?" Dr. Morrison glanced at Inspector Craddock before responding. "Well, the position of the body was rather odd. If he had fallen from the bell platform, one would expect him to land differently, and there are some marks on his hands that don't quite fit with the scenario of an accidental fall." The morning mist was finally beginning to lift, revealing the village in sharp detail under the strengthening sun. But for Miss Marple, the clarity of the day only seemed to emphasize the shadows that were gathering around the mystery of Theodore Aldrich's death, a bell that tolled with no ringer, a body found where it shouldn't be, and marks that told a story different from what first appeared, all the ingredients of a puzzle that would require her most careful attention to unravel. As she stood in the shadow of the ancient church, listening to the murmur of voices and the distant sounds of village life awakening, Miss Marple felt the familiar stirring of curiosity that had so often led her into the darker corners of human nature. The bell had tolled this morning, but she suspected it had rung not for prayer, but for secrets that someone had been desperate to keep silent. Chapter 2. The Rope That Held Secrets. The interior of St. Bartholomew's Church held the accumulated reverence of 7 centuries, its Norman arches soaring toward heaven, while containing very earthly mysteries within their shadows. Miss Marple entered quietly, her sensible shoes making barely a whisper against the worn stone flags that generations of worshippers had polished smooth with their devotion. The familiar scent of beeswax and old incense hung in the air, but today it was tinged with something else, the unmistakable presence of recent death. Inspector Craddock led her toward the bell rope, which hung like a silent sentinel near the chancel steps. The thick hemp rope descended from the darkness above, its end weighted with a colourful woolen sally that generations of ringers had grasped to call the faithful to prayer. Miss Marple approached it with the careful attention she gave to all potential evidence, her keen eyes noting details that others might overlook. "The rope appears undisturbed," Inspector Craddock observed, gesturing toward the neat coils that lay at its base. "Mrs. Weatherby insists she heard the bell tolling, but there's no sign that anyone has pulled this rope recently." Miss Marple knelt carefully beside the rope, her practised gaze taking in the arrangement of the surrounding area. The stone floor was covered with a fine layer of dust. Not unusual in an old church, but the pattern of disturbance told an interesting story. While the rope itself appeared untouched, the dust around its base showed clear signs of recent activity. "How curious," she murmured, pointing to a series of scuff marks in the dust. "Someone has been here, but they weren't using the rope in the conventional manner." She traced the marks with her finger, noting how they formed an irregular circle around the rope's base. These suggest someone was walking around the rope, perhaps examining it from different angles. Her attention was caught by something else, a small smudge of candle wax on the floor about 3 feet from the rope. The wax was still soft, indicating it had been dropped recently, and its colour was a distinctive deep purple that matched the special altar candles used only during Advent and Lent. Since it was late September, the presence of such a candle was highly unusual. "Inspector," she said quietly, "I believe someone was here last night with a candle, examining this rope by candlelight. But they weren't here to ring the bell." Constable Henley, standing respectfully nearby, cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, miss, but if they wasn't ringing the bell, how did Mrs. Weatherby hear it tolling this morning?" It was an excellent question, and Miss Marple found herself studying the architecture above them with renewed interest. The rope disappeared into the darkness of the tower, but she knew that in most churches the bell chamber was accessible by a narrow stone staircase built into the wall. If someone had wanted to make the bell toll without using the rope, they would need to go up to the bell itself. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, addressing the church warden, who had been hovering anxiously near the vestry door, "is there access to the bell chamber from inside the church?" The elderly man nodded gravely. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple. There's a door behind the organ that leads to the tower stairs. Been locked for years, though. Insurance reasons, you understand. Too dangerous for casual visitors." "And who has keys to this door?" Mr. Hartwell looked uncomfortable. "Well, myself, of course. The vicar has one, and—" He hesitated, glancing toward Inspector Craddock. "Theodore had one as well. Sometimes needed access to the tower for maintenance of the clock mechanism." Miss Marple filed this away and continued her examination. Near the organ console she noticed a small gap in the hymnal rack where one book was missing. The absence was barely noticeable unless one was looking carefully, but Miss Marple knew village churches. Everything had its proper place. "Is it usual for hymn books to go missing?" she asked. "Good heavens, no," Mr. Hartwell replied, following her gaze. "Mrs. Pemberton counts them every week after service. She's very particular." He frowned, apparently noticing the gap for the first time. "Strange thing to steal. A hymnal." Inspector Craddock made a note, though Miss Marple could see he wasn't yet convinced of its significance. She, however, had learned that in cases of murder, and she was already beginning to suspect that's what they were dealing with, nothing was insignificant. The missing hymnal, the purple candle wax, the disturbed dust pattern around the bell rope, each detail was a thread in a tapestry that would eventually reveal the truth. Mrs. Weatherby appeared from the vestry, her colour somewhat restored, but her hands still trembling as she arranged a vase of late autumn flowers on the altar. Miss Marple approached gently. "When you heard the bell tolling, did you notice anything unusual about the sound?" The vicar's wife paused, brow furrowed. "Well, now that you mention it, it did sound rather muffled, not like the clear, bright tone we usually hear. And the rhythm was wrong, not the steady toll for morning prayer, but irregular, as if—" She searched for the right words. "As if someone was striking the bell directly rather than pulling the rope." This confirmed Miss Marple's growing theory. Someone had gone up to the bell chamber and struck the bell manually, probably using a hammer or bar. But why go to such lengths, and what had it to do with Theodore Aldrich's death? As if summoned by her thoughts, Dr. Morrison returned from a more detailed examination of the body, his expression troubled. "I'm afraid my initial assessment may have been too hasty," he said in low tones. "While Mr. Aldrich did indeed die from a broken neck, there are aspects that suggest the fall may not have been accidental." Miss Marple moved closer, her acute hearing catching every word. The fracture pattern is consistent with a very specific type of force, and there are bruises on his arms that suggest he may have been restrained or struggled with someone before his death. "Are you telling me this is a murder case, Doctor?" Inspector Craddock asked. "I'm telling you that Theodore Aldrich did not climb that tower of his own free will, and he certainly didn't fall by accident. The implications transformed a tragic accident into something far more sinister." Miss Marple gazed up at the bell tower, its ancient stones now hiding darker secrets. Someone had lured or forced Aldrich up those narrow stairs, killed him in the bell chamber, and then made the bell toll, not as a call to prayer but as a grim signal. The bell had indeed tolled for Theodore Aldrich, and perhaps to announce a secret that someone was willing to kill to protect. The question now was, what secret had been worth a man's life, and who in this peaceful village had proven capable of such deception? Chapter 3. Dust Patterns and Hidden Sins. The bell tower of St. Bartholomew's Church had not been designed for comfort. Miss Marple climbed the narrow stone stairs with careful deliberation, one hand trailing along the rough-hewn wall for balance, while Inspector Craddock led the way with an electric torch. The steps were worn smooth by centuries of use, treacherous in their irregularity, and she could well understand why Theodore Aldrich would have avoided this route if he truly suffered from a fear of heights. "Careful here, Miss Marple," Inspector Craddock warned as they reached a particularly narrow section where the stairs curved sharply around the tower's central column. "The steps are barely wide enough for one person." This struck Miss Marple as significant. If someone had forced Aldrich up these stairs, they would have had to follow behind him, unable to maintain constant visual contact. It suggested either that the victim had gone willingly, which seemed unlikely, or that his attacker had some other means of ensuring compliance. The bell chamber itself was a revelation of medieval engineering. The great bronze bell hung in its wooden frame, surrounded by the apparatus that controlled both the tolling rope below and the clock mechanism that had marked the hours for the village for over 2 centuries. Narrow window openings provided the only natural light, creating a checkerboard of illumination across the ancient timbers. "The body was found just here," Inspector Craddock indicated, pointing to a space beneath the bell where chalk marks now outlined where Aldrich had lain. "Dr. Morrison believes he fell from up there." He directed his torch beam upward to a narrow wooden platform about 8 feet above the floor, accessible only by a ladder built into the wall. Miss Marple studied the scene. If Aldrich had fallen from the platform, his body should have landed squarely beneath it. Instead, the chalk outline showed he had been found several feet away, closer to the bell itself. "How very curious," she murmured, moving carefully to examine the floor. The accumulation of dust and debris told stories that fresher environments could not. Here, every footprint, every disturbance remained preserved. What she found confirmed her growing suspicions. The dust patterns showed clear evidence of a struggle, scuff marks and disturbed areas that spoke of violent movement. More significantly, there were 2 distinct sets of footprints in the dust, one noticeably smaller than the other. "Inspector," she called softly. The beam of light revealed a clear sequence of footprints that told a story of deception and murder. The larger prints, presumably Aldrich's, showed a hesitant, irregular pattern, as if he had been moving reluctantly or under duress. The smaller prints showed confident, purposeful movement around the chamber. "Someone was here with Mr. Aldrich," Inspector Craddock observed grimly, and from the look of these prints they knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple's attention was caught by something else, a small object glinting near the base of the ladder. Kneeling, she identified it as a brass button with an anchor design, the sort used on naval peacoats. The button was bright and recently polished, clearly dropped during the night's events. "Our murderer left more than footprints," she said, holding it up. "This hasn't been here long. The brass is too bright, and there's no dust around it." While the inspector photographed the area, Miss Marple continued her examination. Near one of the narrow windows she found evidence of the method used to toll the bell without the rope. A heavy iron bar, likely from the church's fire tools, lay abandoned in a corner, its business end showing fresh scratches consistent with striking bronze. Corresponding marks marred the bell itself. "So, our killer brought Aldrich up here, murdered him, and then used this bar to strike the bell," Inspector Craddock summarized. But why make the bell toll at all? Why draw attention? It was an excellent question. In Miss Marple's experience, murderers who announced their crimes were often motivated by more than simple violence. They were making a statement, settling a score, or attempting to communicate something to the community. Perhaps the tolling was meant as a funeral bell for Mr. Aldrich, she suggested, or meant to suggest his death was tied to his duties in the church. Back in the nave, the parish ladies had gathered, the normal life of the church asserting itself despite the morning's tragedy. It was Mrs. Pemberton from the post office who provided the next piece. "Such a shock about poor Theodore," she said to Mrs. Hartwell, "and after the week he's had too. Did you know he'd been asking questions? About old parish records. Came into the post office Tuesday last wanting to know about registered letters from 20 years ago." Miss Marple's ears pricked up. "What sort of questions?" "He wanted to know about a particular letter sent registered to London back in 1933, seemed very agitated, needed to know if it had been properly delivered. I told him those records would be in the regional office, but he seemed to think I might remember." Fascinating. If Aldrich had been investigating old correspondence, he had discovered something connecting past to present. "Did he mention what the letter concerned?" "No," Mrs. Pemberton said, "but he did say it was about something that happened in the parish that should have been reported to the authorities. Kept muttering about things that should have been brought to light years ago." Miss Marple began to see the outlines of a motive. Aldrich had been investigating a long-buried secret, significant enough that someone was willing to commit murder to keep it hidden. The missing hymnal, the purple candle wax, the elaborate staging in the bell tower, everything pointed to a crime rooted in the past, but with very present consequences. The bell had tolled this morning, not just for Aldrich's death, but for the resurrection of secrets someone thought safely buried 20 years ago. In St. Bartholomew's Hollow, it seemed, the past was never quite as dead as it appeared. Chapter 4. The Missing Hymnal Speaks. The discovery that Theodore Aldrich had been investigating old parish records cast an entirely new light on his murder, and Miss Marple found herself drawn to explore the church's archives with renewed purpose. The vestry of St. Ephraim's served as both storage space and unofficial office for the parish's administrative business. Its oak panels lined with cupboards containing the accumulated documentation of 7 centuries of worship, births, deaths, and the countless small dramas that comprised village life. Mrs. Weatherby, still pale but determined to maintain her normal routines, had graciously agreed to show Miss Marple through the records. "Theodore had been spending quite a lot of time here recently," she explained, unlocking a particularly ancient-looking cabinet. "The vicar thought he was researching the church's musical history for the Harvest Festival programme, but now I wonder if his interests were rather more specific." The cabinet revealed a treasure trove of parish documents, baptismal registers, marriage records, account books, and correspondence dating back to the Reformation, but it was immediately apparent that someone had been through these materials recently. Documents that should have been filed in chronological order were scattered, and several folders showed signs of hasty examination. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, noting the disarray. "It appears Mr. Aldrich was looking for something specific. Do you recall him asking about any particular time period?" Mrs. Weatherby frowned thoughtfully. "He did seem particularly interested in the records from the early 1930s. Said he was trying to verify some information about a former organist. But when I offered to help, he became quite evasive. Most unlike Theodore, he was usually so forthcoming about his research." The mention of a former organist caught Miss Marple's attention immediately. "Someone who preceded Mr. Aldrich in the position?" "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Weatherby. "There was young Mr. Blackwood, James Blackwood. Talented musician, came to us straight from the cathedral in Winchester. This would have been 1932 or 1933, I believe. He only stayed about 2 years before moving on to a better position in London." Miss Marple made a mental note of this information, while continuing to examine the disturbed documents. Among the scattered papers, she noticed that several items were missing. Clean squares in the dust showed where files had been removed, and the alphabetical arrangement had obvious gaps. "Mrs. Weatherby," she said carefully, "you mentioned that someone was responsible for counting the hymnals each week. Might we speak with her about the missing book I noticed?" Mrs. Pemberton was summoned from her flower-arranging duties, and arrived with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being consulted about parish matters. Her examination of the hymnal rack was thorough and immediately revealing. "Number 47, she announced with certainty. "That's what's missing. I know because I specifically remember noting last Sunday that the binding was coming loose. It's one of the older volumes from the 1925 printing." This detail struck Miss Marple as significant. Is there anything special about that particular hymnal, any markings or additions that might make it different from the others? Mrs. Pemberton's face lit up with the satisfaction of someone whose attention to detail had proved valuable. As a matter of fact, yes. That particular book belonged to the organist before Theodore, young Mr. Blackwood, always used it for services, said the margin notes helped with his arrangements. When he left, the book stayed behind. We don't usually allow people to take church property. The connection between the missing hymnal and the mysterious James Blackwood was too convenient to be coincidental. Miss Marple wondered what sort of margin notes a young organist might have made that would prove significant 20 years later. "Is Mr. Blackwood still in London?" she inquired. "Has the parish maintained any contact with him?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. Mrs. Weatherby exchanged glances with Mrs. Pemberton, and both women looked toward Mr. Hartwell, who had joined them. "Well," Mr. Hartwell said finally, "that's rather a delicate matter. James Blackwood left under somewhat unusual circumstances." Miss Marple waited, patiently. She could sense they were approaching the heart of the secret Theodore Aldrich had been investigating. "There was some question about the parish funds," Mrs. Weatherby said reluctantly. "Nothing was ever proven, you understand. But there were discrepancies in the accounts during his time here. The matter was handled very discreetly. The vicar felt it would be better for everyone if James simply moved on to a fresh start." "And was this matter reported to the authorities?" Miss Marple asked gently. Another pause. "The vicar at the time, that would be Canon Dithridge, felt that Christian charity demanded we handle the matter privately. James was very young, and there were thought to be extenuating circumstances." Miss Marple began to understand the shape of the secret that had cost Theodore Aldrich his life. A young organist suspected of embezzlement, given a quiet departure rather than prosecution, and 20 years later someone discovering evidence that perhaps the matter had not been as simple as it appeared. "Mrs. Weatherby," she said, "do you happen to know what these extenuating circumstances were?" The vicar's wife looked acutely uncomfortable. "There were rumours," she said finally, "about James and one of the young ladies in the parish, someone he was fond of. The suggestion was that, if there had been any irregularities with the funds, they might have been motivated by personal difficulties rather than greed. The picture became clearer. A young man involved in an inappropriate relationship, possibly taking money to support it, and a parish choosing discretion over justice. But something had prompted Theodore Aldrich to reopen this old scandal, and his investigation had led to murder. "This young lady," Miss Marple continued, "would she still be in the village?" "Oh yes," Mrs. Pemberton said before the others could stop her. "That would be Susan, Mrs. Crawford now, married Dr. Crawford just 6 months after James left. Quite a relief to her parents, I can tell you." Miss Marple filed this away. Mrs. Crawford, the doctor's wife, one of the most respected women in the village, had once been romantically involved with the suspected embezzler. If Theodore Aldrich had discovered evidence implicating her, it might well have provided a motive for murder. As she prepared to leave the vestry, Miss Marple reflected on the complex web of secrets emerging from her investigation. The missing hymnal, the disturbed parish records, the mysterious registered letter, all pointed to a 20-year-old scandal someone had been desperate to keep buried. The bell had tolled this morning not just for Theodore Aldrich's death, but for the revival of secrets that had shaped this community for 2 decades. In her experience, the most dangerous secrets were those involving respected members of society, people whose reputations were worth killing to protect. Tomorrow, she decided, she would pay a visit to Mrs. Crawford. It was time to discover what connection the doctor's wife might have to a missing hymnal and a murder in the bell tower. Chapter 5. A Crack in the Foundation. Miss Marple's visit to Dr. Crawford's house the following morning was timed to coincide with the doctor's departure for his rounds, ensuring that she would find Mrs. Susan Crawford alone. The Crawford residence stood at the prosperous end of the village, a handsome Georgian house set back from the road behind a well-maintained garden that spoke of both good taste and sufficient means to indulge it. The woman who answered Miss Marple's gentle knock was immediately recognisable as someone who had once been considered a great beauty. Susan Crawford retained the elegant bones and graceful carriage that had undoubtedly made her the toast of St. Bartholomew's Hollow 20 years earlier, though her dark hair now showed threads of silver and her blue eyes held the shadows of someone who had learned to guard her secrets carefully. She received Miss Marple with the correct degree of courtesy, but there was a weariness in her manner, suggesting she was prepared for difficult questions. "How kind of you to call," Mrs. Crawford said, leading Miss Marple into a sitting room that was the epitome of conservative good taste. "I understand you've been helping Inspector Craddock with the dreadful business at the church. Such a shock about poor Theodore." Miss Marple accepted the offered tea while studying her hostess carefully. Mrs. Crawford's hands showed a slight tremor as she poured, and there were dark circles under her eyes, suggesting recent sleepless nights. More tellingly, Miss Marple noticed a small bandage on the woman's right index finger, the sort of injury one might sustain from handling papers carelessly, or perhaps breaking glass. "Indeed, it's been most distressing for the entire village," Miss Marple agreed. "I understand Mr. Aldrich had been researching the church's musical history. Did he ever speak to you about his work?" A slight tightening around Mrs. Crawford's eyes suggested the question had struck home. "We weren't particularly close," she replied carefully. Theodore was rather focused on his music, not much given to social conversation. "Of course," Miss Marple nodded understandingly, "though I gather he had become interested in the period when Mr. Blackwood was organist. You would have known Mr. Blackwood, I believe?" The teacup rattled slightly against its saucer as Mrs. Crawford set it down. "James Blackwood, yes, I knew him slightly. He was organist here before my marriage. A very talented young man, though he didn't stay long." Miss Marple observed the careful neutrality of this response. "I believe there were some unfortunate circumstances surrounding his departure." "I really wouldn't know about that," Mrs. Crawford said quickly. "I was quite young at the time, and not involved in church administration. Perhaps you should speak to Mr. Hartwell about such matters." The deflection was smoothly done, but Miss Marple had noticed something significant. Mrs. Crawford wore a wedding ring and an engagement ring, both valuable and well maintained, but there was a pale mark on her finger suggesting that another ring had been recently removed, perhaps one that held memories too painful or dangerous to wear. "While discussing the past, Mrs. Crawford," Miss Marple said gently, "I noticed you seem to have injured your finger recently. I do hope it's nothing serious." The question caught Mrs. Crawford off guard. Her hand moved instinctively to cover the bandaged finger, and for a moment her composure slipped entirely. "Just a silly accident," she said quickly. "I was cleaning out some old papers and cut myself on a broken picture frame." Miss Marple filed this information away while continuing her careful questioning. "How unfortunate. I do hope the papers weren't damaged. Old documents can be so fragile, and once destroyed, they're irreplaceable." The colour drained from Mrs. Crawford's face, and Miss Marple knew she had struck close to the truth. "I believe Mr. Aldrich had been asking questions about old parish correspondence, something about a registered letter from the 1930s. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Mrs. Crawford rose abruptly, moving to the window with agitated steps. "Miss Marple, I really don't understand why you're asking these questions. Theodore's death was a tragic accident. Surely all this talk about old letters and parish records is just stirring up gossip that's better left buried." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "But I'm afraid murder has a way of bringing buried things to light, whether we wish it or not." The word murder hung in the air between them like an accusation. Mrs. Crawford turned from the window, her face now openly frightened. "Murder? But Inspector Craddock said—" "Inspector Craddock is a thorough man," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "and his investigation has revealed that Mr. Aldrich did not die accidentally. Someone killed him, Mrs. Crawford, someone who had access to the church and knowledge of its layout, someone who knew that Mr. Aldrich would be vulnerable if lured to the bell tower." Mrs. Crawford sank back into her chair, her hands trembling so violently that she clasped them together to maintain composure. "This is terrible," she whispered. "Absolutely terrible." Miss Marple leaned forward with sympathy. "Mrs. Crawford, I believe you know something about why Theodore Aldrich was killed. Perhaps you didn't intend for things to go so far, but Secrets have a way of growing beyond our control. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock. Then Mrs. Crawford began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. James Blackwood, she began, was not the man everyone thought he was when he came to the parish. He was charming, talented, and I was very young and foolish. I thought myself in love with him. Miss Marple waited patiently as Mrs. Crawford gathered courage to continue. He convinced me to help him with what he called temporary borrowing from the parish funds. Said he needed money to establish himself properly, to buy better clothes for his position, to save enough to marry me. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. The picture became clearer. A young woman infatuated with a charming musician, manipulated into helping with embezzlement she didn't fully understand. But James never intended to marry me, Mrs. Crawford continued bitterly. When the discrepancies were discovered, he let me know that if the matter was investigated thoroughly, all the evidence would point to me. The transactions I had helped arrange, the access I had to parish records through my volunteer work, it would all look as though I was the guilty party. And so you allowed him to leave quietly while you remained under suspicion. Canon Dithridge was a kind man. He believed James's story, that I had been led astray by romantic feelings, that I was more sinned against than sinning. The parish agreed to handle the matter privately. I was so grateful to escape prosecution that I agreed never to speak of it again. Miss Marple was beginning to understand the full scope of the deception. But you kept some evidence, didn't you? Some proof of James Blackwood's real guilt. Mrs. Crawford nodded miserably. James had written me letters detailing exactly how we should handle the money transfers. I kept them, thinking they might protect me someday. They were hidden in my personal hymnal, the one I used when I sang in the choir. The missing hymnal. Miss Marple felt the satisfaction of another piece falling into place. And Theodore Aldrich discovered these letters last week. Yes, Mrs. Crawford said. He'd been researching old parish records and somehow found reference to a registered letter that James had sent to London, a letter that mentioned money he'd stolen and his plans to disappear. Theodore came to see me, said he'd put together enough pieces to understand what had really happened 20 years ago. What did he want from you? Mrs. Crawford's voice broke. Justice, he said. It wasn't right that James had escaped while I lived under the shadow of suspicion all these years. He wanted me to give him the letters so he could set the record straight, prove I'd been a victim rather than a willing accomplice. Miss Marple could see the terrible irony. Theodore Aldrich had been trying to clear Mrs. Crawford's name, but his efforts had threatened to destroy the life she had built. But you couldn't allow that, Miss Marple said gently, because the scandal would have ruined your marriage, your position in the community, everything you'd worked 20 years to establish. I tried to explain to Theodore that it was too late for justice, that bringing up the past would hurt innocent people, my husband, my children. But he wouldn't listen. He said the truth had to come out no matter the cost. So you arranged to meet him at the church? Mrs. Crawford nodded, tears now flowing. I told him I would give him the letters, but I needed time to prepare my family for what was coming. We agreed to meet after midnight in the church, where we could talk privately. And you brought the purple candle to provide light. Mrs. Crawford looked startled. How did you... Yes, I took one of the Advent candles from the vestry storage. I thought if we met in the bell tower, no one would see the light and interrupt us. Miss Marple could visualize the scene. Two people meeting in secret. One determined to reveal an old injustice, the other desperate to protect a carefully constructed new life. What happened? Theodore had already examined the church records, found references to the money transfers and the letter James sent to London. He was certain he was doing the right thing, so convinced that justice delayed was justice denied. When I tried once more to explain why the truth couldn't come out, he became angry, said I was still protecting James after all these years. I tried to take the hymnal from him, to get back the letters before he could use them. We struggled at the top of the bell tower. Theodore lost his footing and fell against the bell platform. I heard his neck break. Miss Marple absorbed the confession with the sad understanding of someone who had seen how good intentions could lead to tragic consequences. And then you made the bell toll. I was in shock. I didn't know what to do. Then I remembered something James had once told me, how churches used to toll the bell when someone died suddenly, to warn the village. I thought if I made it look like Theodore had come to the tower for some official purpose, perhaps no one would question why he was there. But you took the hymnal with you. I couldn't leave it. The letters were still hidden inside. They would have proven everything Theodore had discovered. I destroyed them that night along with the hymnal. That's when I cut my finger, burning the papers in my fireplace. As Mrs. Crawford finished her confession, Miss Marple felt the familiar mixture of sadness and satisfaction that accompanied the resolution of a mystery. The bell had indeed tolled for Theodore Aldrich, but it had also tolled for the end of a 20-year deception that had finally claimed its ultimate victim. "Mrs. Crawford," she said gently, "I believe you should speak to Inspector Craddock. This has been a burden you've carried quite long enough." Through the sitting-room window, Miss Marple could see the church tower, rising against the morning sky, its bell now silent, but its stones holding the echoes of secrets, lies, and the terrible price of justice delayed too long. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Letter surfaces. Inspector Craddock listened to Mrs. Crawford's confession with the calm of a man who had heard many tragedies, yet there was a flicker of compassion in his eyes as the weary woman spoke. Her husband sat beside her, silent and stricken, his doctor's hands clenched in helpless understanding. When she finished, Craddock said quietly, "Mrs. Crawford, I must caution you that what you've told us constitutes an admission to causing Mr. Aldrich's death. The law will consider your circumstances, but I must place you under arrest." Mrs. Crawford nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "It's almost a relief, Inspector. The truth has lived inside me like a sickness." After the formalities, Miss Marple lingered behind, her gaze resting on the woman's trembling hands. "You carried this burden alone for 20 years, my dear," she said softly. "But sometimes silence creates its own chain of cruelty." When Mrs. Crawford was led away, Miss Marple turned to the inspector. "There is still something missing. People rarely act from one motive alone." Later that afternoon, at Theodore Aldrich's cottage, the two investigators searched among his neatly stacked papers. The small room smelled faintly of polish and lavender soap. On the writing desk, Miss Marple found a folder marked Parish Records. Inside were copies of financial ledgers from the 1930s and a letter dated 3 weeks earlier, from James Blackwood. It was written in elegant, decisive script. "My dear Theodore, conscience compels me to speak." The letter claimed that Susan Crawford had been the mastermind behind an embezzlement 20 years ago, using her access to parish accounts and his cooperation as organist. Blackwood painted himself as the victim, driven by youthful weakness. "How convenient," murmured Miss Marple. "He waits 20 years, then sends a letter rewriting history." Craddock frowned as he read. "He even claims to have proof, documents with her signature." Among Theodore's notebooks lay pages of careful reflection. He had weighed truth against mercy and written, "I cannot allow Mrs. Crawford to bear guilt that may not be her own. I shall meet her and settle the matter quietly." Miss Marple sighed. He meant to clear her name, not destroy it. In another folder, Theodore had begun analysing Blackwood's so-called evidence, noting irregular handwriting and modern paper. "He suspected forgery," Craddock said. "That means Aldrich was on the verge of exposing Blackwood himself." Miss Marple gazed toward the window where the church spire rose through mist. "Then the tragedy was born of misunderstanding," she said. "Theodore sought justice. Mrs. Crawford thought he sought revenge. Between those two beliefs, truth lost its footing." The inspector closed the folder with quiet respect. "He died for honesty." "No," Miss Marple corrected gently. "He died for someone else's fear." Chapter 7. Echoes from London Town. The following morning word arrived from Scotland Yard. James Blackwood, now living under the alias James Thornfield, had been located in London. Inspector Craddock received the call while Miss Marple poured tea in the police station's cold little office. "It seems our repentant musician reinvented himself," he said dryly. "Private music tutor, some success, and several complaints of blackmail." Mrs. Crawford, summoned once more, turned pale at the name. Then he truly meant to ruin me. Miss Marple nodded. Blackmail thrives on fear, dear lady. It seems you were not his first nor last victim. When they examined further correspondence from Theodore's files, a clearer picture emerged. Blackwood's letter had not been a confession. It was bait. He had sent similar letters to other acquaintances, manipulating the past for profit. He dangled conscience as a fishing line, Miss Marple murmured. That afternoon, Mrs. Crawford finally produced another letter she had hidden, one written a month before Theodore's death. It was unsigned, but the handwriting was unmistakably Blackwood's. My dear Susan, it began, I've preserved your secret all these years, but recent circumstances compel me to seek your assistance once more. The tone was cruelly polite. He demanded financial support to maintain his silence, threatening exposure if she refused. Miss Marple's voice was gentle but firm. You received this, and then, days later, Theodore began asking questions about parish records. You must have believed the two men were working together. Mrs. Crawford's eyes filled with tears. Yes, I thought James had sent him. I was terrified. Inspector Craddock considered the evidence carefully. So, when she met Aldrich in the bell tower, she believed he came to extort her. Miss Marple nodded. And he believed he came to free her. Two intentions, both honest, both fatal. They agreed that Blackwood's arrest was now inevitable. Scotland Yard would handle the London end. Craddock would prepare an affidavit. Yet even as the paperwork began, Miss Marple felt a lingering unease. Fear drives people to strange acts, she mused aloud. But guilt drives them to silence. Somewhere in this business, someone else heard that bell ring and said nothing. The inspector looked at her sharply. You think another person was involved? Perhaps not in the murder, Miss Marple said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. But I've learned that secrets seldom travel alone. Chapter 8. When Stones Remember Truth. The telegram from Scotland Yard arrived 2 days later. James Blackwood, alias Thornfield, had been arrested on multiple counts of blackmail. The report detailed his sordid habits, tracing old acquaintances, threatening exposure, and inventing new confessions when old ones lost power. A pattern of cowardice dressed as remorse, Miss Marple said, as she read the file. When Mrs. Crawford heard, she wept again, this time from relief. Then Theodore truly meant to help me. Yes, said Miss Marple softly. His death was the tolling of truth through misunderstanding. Still, questions remained. Miss Marple returned to the church to reflect. The bell tower stood silent now, its rope neatly coiled. The air smelled of old stone and beeswax. She laid a gloved hand on the railing, feeling the faint chill that lingered where lives had crossed. Inspector Craddock joined her there, carrying fresh documents. Blackwood's letters were forgeries, he confirmed. Every signature, every date, fabricated. Aldrich's notes proved correct. If he'd lived another day, he might have cleared Mrs. Crawford completely. Miss Marple nodded. And yet she confessed to murder. Guilt can make saints of the innocent, Craddock said quietly. They stepped outside into the pale sunlight. The village moved on, shop doors opened, children chased a ball across the green, but the sound of that morning's bell still echoed faintly in their minds. Miss Marple paused near the lych gate. Theodore was not the only victim. Mrs. Crawford lost 20 years to silence, and Mr. Blackwood, for all his cleverness, has sentenced himself to a life where every lie required another to survive. Justice will deal with him, said Craddock. But justice cannot resurrect what fear destroyed, Miss Marple replied. She glanced toward the tower. Stones remember truth, Inspector. They hold it longer than we do. Chapter 9. The sole witness speaks. It was nearly a week before the next revelation arrived. Constable Henley, normally unflappable, burst into the station breathless. Inspector, Mr. Hartwell wishes to speak. He's remembered something about the night Mr. Aldrich died. The elderly churchwarden arrived soon after, pale and agitated. I wasn't honest before, he began. That night I couldn't sleep. I took a walk past the church and saw Mrs. Crawford enter, carrying a candle. 10 minutes later, another figure followed, a man in a naval peacoat. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "A naval coat, you say?" Hartwell nodded. "Yes. I recognised him later. Captain Morrison, Dr. Crawford's brother." The room fell silent. Craddock straightened. "You're certain of that?" "Quite certain," said Hartwell. "I didn't speak out earlier. I feared scandal." An hour later, Captain Morrison appeared voluntarily. Calm but visibly burdened, he said, "I followed Susan that night at my brother's request. He feared she might harm herself. When I reached the bell tower, she was struggling with Aldrich. I tried to separate them. In the chaos, Aldrich fell. His neck broke before I could catch him." "You caused the fall?" Craddock asked. "Accidentally," Morrison said. "Susan believed she'd done it. She insisted I leave, said her reputation was already ruined. Mine was not." Miss Marple studied his uniform coat. One brass button was missing, the same kind found at the scene. "And you remained silent for a week." "A coward's silence," he said quietly. For a long moment no one spoke. Then Miss Marple said, "The bell tolled that morning for misunderstanding, Captain. Not for malice, but silence can be as fatal as guilt." Chapter 10. The Bell Tolls for Truth. By the time autumn sunlight slanted through St. Bartholomew's stained glass, the case had reached its weary conclusion. Mrs. Crawford's charge was reduced to manslaughter. Captain Morrison faced reprimand but no prison. James Blackwood, however, was sentenced for blackmail and fraud. The bell that had tolled for fear now tolled for judgment. Miss Marple attended the final service held before the Crawfords left the village. Dr. Crawford greeted her quietly. "You've given us truth, Miss Marple, though it cost us everything." She smiled faintly. "Truth always collects its debt, Doctor, yet it frees what lies beneath." After the service, the church stood silent again. Mr. Hartwell polished the brass candlesticks. Sunlight touched the bell rope like a blessing. Outside, the air was crisp, the village peaceful once more. Miss Marple lingered at the lych gate, listening to distant chimes. She thought of Theodore Aldrich, the man who died seeking justice, and of Susan Crawford, who found redemption through confession. She thought of Captain Morrison's courage, too late but sincere, and of the hollow echo of James Blackwood's name. In every tragedy, she reflected, there was a note of mercy if one listened deeply enough. The bell above her was still, yet in her mind it rang, a clear, measured tone that spoke of endings and renewal. The bell that had once rung for no one had, in the end, tolled for everyone, for truth, for forgiveness, for the unmasking of human frailty. As Miss Marple turned toward Rose Cottage, the setting sun caught her silver hair, and she smiled faintly. The world, she thought, would always hide its secrets, but the truth, like the sound of a bell, could never remain silent forever.